Are you sure you truly know yourself? Be careful. What you call your personality might just be a mask, and behind that mask lurking in silence is a force shaping your decisions, reactions, relationships, and failures. Carl Jung called it the shadow, but this isn't some poetic metaphor. It's your unconscious nature, filled with everything you've rejected, denied, or buried. And it's running the show far more than you think. The harder you try to be a good person, the more you may be suppressing the most essential parts of yourself. That unexplained anger, that hidden shame, that sudden emotional spiral, those aren't flaws, they're signals. Warnings from your shadow that something inside you has gone unheard for too long. And here's the disturbing truth. What you ignore in yourself doesn't disappear. It waits. But what if I told you that within that darkness lies your greatest strength, your untapped creativity, your repressed power, your intuitive brilliance, locked away in the very parts of you feared the most? In this video, you'll discover how the shadow forms, how it secretly influences your life, and how to finally face it. We'll dive deep into Jung's teachings on the anima, animus, and the path to reclaiming your inner wholeness. And if something already stirred inside you just from hearing this, then stay with me until the end, because this journey might reveal more about yourself than years of surface-level self-help. Oh, and while you're here, quietly hit that subscribe button. This space is for those ready to stop pretending and start evolving for real. Have you ever noticed how sometimes what holds us back the most doesn't come from the outside but from within? Carl Jung was very clear about this. He argued that humanity's greatest threat isn't war, pandemics, or economic collapse. It's the human being fighting against himself. Someone unaware of their unconscious nature is like driving a car blindfolded. We get distracted by the noise of the world, but the real ticking time bomb lies in our inner silence where the shadow lives. This shadow Jung talked so much about isn't just poetic symbolism, it's a real archetype. It represents everything we sweep under the rug of the soul: repressed anger, forbidden desires, unresolved trauma. And the less aware we are of it, the more these forces sneak into our daily lives. Think about that colleague who keeps sabotaging his own job, or the friend stuck in toxic patterns who doesn't know why. That's the shadow, playing chess behind the scenes of the mind. What's fascinating is how many people consider themselves too nice, and that's already a warning sign. According to Carl Jung, the more someone rejects the idea of having a dark side, the more the shadow gains power backstage. It doesn't disappear, it just changes outfits. And guess what? It loves sophisticated disguises, biting sarcasm, existential crisis, impulsive decisions. The issue isn't having a shadow. The real problem is not knowing it's there, waiting for the perfect moment to take control when you least expect it. Carl Jung used to say, the more you deny your shadow, the more it controls you. Sounds paradoxical, right? But it's the truth. Everything we bury deep inside, fears, anger, jealousy, shame, doesn't just vanish. It sits there, fermenting, in the background, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. And when it does, it's rarely subtle. It can show up as a sudden outburst, a self-sabotaging choice, or behavior you can't explain. That's your unconscious nature grabbing the steering wheel. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean giving space to evil. Quite the opposite. It's like turning on the lights in a messy room. You're not creating the mess by switching on the light. You're just seeing it clearly. Carl Jung teaches that we can only heal what we have the courage to face. Pretending to be fine or pure only strengthens the shadow, because the shadow thrives in darkness. The process begins the moment you stop running from yourself and start confronting what's hidden honestly, but without judgment. How many times has someone snapped at you over something minor? Or how often have you done the same and later thought, that didn't even feel like me? That's the shadow in action. And it happens to all of us. But the difference between those who are ruled by it and those who integrate it lies in awareness. The first reacts and then justifies. The second pauses, investigates the trigger, and chooses how to respond. That's the turning point when reactivity gives way to conscious mastery. Many people think self-awareness is just about knowing your strengths. Nope. Real self-awareness involves scrubbing the ego clean. It means looking at your arrogance, control issues, your secret enjoyment of gossip. Sounds heavy. It is, but it's also liberating. Carl Jung once said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Without that, you're just pretending. You're not evolving, you're performing. A practical way to begin this journey is to keep a reaction journal. Seriously, just do it. Anytime something deeply triggers you, a criticism, rejection, a power struggle, write it down. For example, I felt furious when my friend cut me off. Then ask, why did that bother me so much? Often, you'll find a slice of your unconscious nature begging to be acknowledged. This alone is a powerful step toward integrating your shadow with full awareness. It's not just about emotions. Pay attention to strange coincidences too. Jung called these synchronicities. Ever had a random thought about someone you argued with, and they suddenly text you the same day? These coincidences are sometimes your shadow speaking in symbols. Don't ignore them. They may also be signs from your anima or animasto's inner forces, pushing for balance within your psyche. Watch out for the overly spiritual types who say, I never feel anger. Big red flag. Carl Jung warned that repressing a part of your psyche only gives it more power later. The shadow is persistent. It won't leave just because you pretend it's not there. It doesn't want to dominate, you just need to listen. The moment you give it a voice, it starts shifting from enemy to ally. Relationships are one of the fastest ways to meet your shadow. You project what you don't see in yourself onto others. A woman who keeps attracting aggressive men might be avoiding her own distorted animus. A man who falls for rescuing women may be blind to his wounded anima. When we fail to integrate these elements, we become slaves to them. Man's life becomes a loop of repeated heartaches, dressed up as fate. The path of integration doesn't require perfection, it requires presence. It takes courage to look inward, even when it hurts. Carl Jung never promised this would be easy, but he did promise it would be worth it. Once you integrate your shadow, you gain a strange, serene power. You stop trying to be good, and instead become wholesome one, who knows their inner monsters and has learned to dance with them. This has nothing to do with shallow self-help fluff. This is ancient, deep psychological work. Indigenous cultures had rituals to face their inner demons. Today, we do it through therapy, journaling, dream analysis, or even deep meditative practices. The tools have changed, but the mission is the same. Face what hides in the dark and bring it into the light. That's where real personal power is born. And remember, integrating your shadow doesn't mean letting it lead your life. It means recognizing it, understanding what it wants, and choosing your response. That's how you stop being a puppet of your unconscious nature and start living with real freedom. And speaking of masks, that brings us to a powerful next step in Carl Jung's work, the origin of the shadow and the inner war with the persona. The shadow doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It's shape-sculpted really, from childhood on. Every time you were told, don't act like that, boys don't cry, or good girls don't get angry, a part of you got pushed into hiding. Carl Jung called this repression, and it's the soil where the shadow takes root. You didn't stop feeling those things, you just learned not to show them. Over time, they went underground, into your unconscious nature, building a silent version of you, unspoken but still very active. Then enters the persona, that social mask we all wear. It's the version of us that plays nice, fits in, and keeps things under control. Jung explained that the persona is necessary. It helps us navigate society, jobs, family dinners, but it's also dangerous when we start mistaking it for who we really are. Think about that person who's always on, always smiling, always polite till one day they break down or lash out. The wider the gap between the persona and the shadow, the more explosive the consequences. What's tricky is that the persona is often rewarded. You get praise for being agreeable, patient, and productive. Meanwhile, the shadow grows stronger in silence, and the more you identify with the mask, the more alien your real self begins to feel. You lose touch with your inner instincts, your raw emotions, your primal truth. That's why Carl Jung warned us, when you over-identify with the persona, the shadow doesn't disappear. It waits until it finds a crack. Let's take a common example, the overachiever. On the surface, they're disciplined, driven, successful, but underneath, they may be haunted by deep insecurities, fear of failure, or suppressed rage from unmet childhood needs. These repressed feelings form the shadow that drives their compulsive need to prove themselves. Their persona says, I'm in control, but their unconscious nature screams, I'm terrified of being seen as weak. That's how the shadow silently directs the show. And what about people pleasers? They smile through discomfort, agree to things they hate, and avoid confrontation like the plague. Their shadow often holds resentment, suppressed boundaries, and anger they never learned to express. Over time, this internal tension builds into anxiety, passive aggression, or even illness. Carl Jung would say, "They're not bad people, they're just living too far from their shadow, and that distance has a price." Anima and animus also get caught in this dynamic. When these inner forces are repressed, they warp. A man disconnected from his anima might become emotionally numb or overly rational. A woman cut off from her animus may struggle with assertiveness or fall into dependency patterns. These distortions then feed the shadow. The only way to rebalance is to recognize and reintegrate these inner opposites, give them room to speak without shame or suppression. School systems and rigid parenting often feed the persona. Sit still, follow rules, don't question authority. These environments reward uniformity, not individuality. And so, the shadow grows in young people who learn to hide their quirks, creativity, even their gender identity or emotional truth. By adulthood, many are so adapted to the persona they have no idea who they really are. Jung would call this a spiritual emergency disguised as success. Social media makes this worse. It rewards perfectly curated persona smiles, filters, quotes, perfection. No one posts their shadow. But behind every influencer, there's a human being with jealousy, fear, insecurity, just like everyone else. The danger. When we compare our shadow to someone else's persona, we feel broken, but we're not. We're just unaware of how deep our unconscious nature actually goes. That ignorance is what keeps the suffering alive. So how do we begin to reconcile the two, shadow and persona? The first step is honesty. Radical, uncomfortable honesty. Ask yourself, where in your life are you pretending? Where are you wearing a mask just to be accepted? Then, go deeper. What parts of yourself have you silenced to keep that mask intact? These questions aren't easy, but they crack the persona wide open. Letting the shadow breathe for the first time. Another powerful tool is dream work. Carl Jung was fascinated by dreams because they reveal the parts of us the persona hides. Nightmares, in particular, often show shadow elements, chased by a monster, trapped in a basement, attacked by something we can't see. Jung taught that these symbols are not to be feared. They're messages from your unconscious nature, asking to be heard. Recording and interpreting dreams can be a game changer in your self-integration journey. Once you start this process, the mask begins to loosen. You realize the persona was never you, it was just your social strategy. And your shadow, it's not evil, it's your wounded, wild, creative self that's been locked in a basement for too long. And when you finally let them talk, persona and shadow, you don't just survive, you begin to heal. And speaking of healing, things get even more interesting when we explore the deeper energies within the psychos of the anima, animus, and the self. Carl Jung didn't just stop at the shadow. He dove deeper into the hidden architecture of the psyche and discovered something extraordinary. Within every person exists a divine polarity. He called it the anima in men and the animus in women. These are not random traits. They're ancient blueprints of balance. The anima is the inner feminine intuitive feeling, creative. The animus is the inner masculine logic, direction, reason. Ignoring either side creates imbalance, distortion, and internal conflict. Think about the emotionally distant man who's all business. He may be successful, but he's often deeply disconnected from his inner world. His anima is exiled, buried under layers of achievement and rationality. On the flip side, the woman who constantly doubts herself, searching for someone to lead her, might be cut off from her animus, the strength and clarity she already holds inside. Jung believed that healing comes when these opposites are integrated, honored, and expressed. This process isn't about becoming less of a man or less of a woman. It's about becoming more whole. Carl Jung taught that true individuation, the path to inner fulfillment, requires this inner marriage. When a man connects with his anima, he becomes more emotionally intelligent, more empathetic, more complete. When a woman reconnects with her animus, she finds her voice, her certainty, her grounded authority. It's not about about balance. And then there's the ego. Oh, the tricky little ego. According to Jung, it's only a fragment of who you are. Most people spend their whole lives building up their ego identity, career, roles, titles, labels, without realizing it's just a surface-level construct. The real you, the total you, is something far greater. Jung called it the higher self, to be exact. It's the full integration of conscious and unconscious, shadow and persona, anima, animus, and everything in between. You've probably felt the self before, that rare moment of inner peace when everything just clicks, when your thoughts, feelings, actions, and instincts all move in harmony. That's not just a good mood, that's alignment. It's a signal that your unconscious nature and conscious mind are dancing together instead of pulling in opposite directions. These moments are sacred. They're the breadcrumbs that lead back to your deepest truth. In spiritual traditions, this is often described as awakening. But Jung's version wasn't abstract or mystical, it was grounded. He didn't talk about escaping reality. He wanted us to embrace it fully, to know ourselves so deeply that we stop projecting, stop blaming, stop fearing our own depths. Integration of anima and animus isn't enlightenment on a mountaintop, it's awareness at the dinner table, compassion in conflict, and courage in silence. What makes this journey so difficult is that the ego resists it. It doesn't like being dethroned, and let's be real, connecting with your anima as a man may feel like weakness at first. Reclaiming your animus as a woman might trigger guilt, even shame. That's how conditioning works. But as Jung would say, you are not what has happened to you. You are what you choose to become. You're not your past roles. You're the architect of your reintegration. One way to begin this reconnection is through symbolic work. Art, dance, writing, meditation. These help you tap into the deeper energies without filtering everything through logic. A man painting his emotions is not soft, he's alive. A woman setting firm boundaries isn't harsh, she's reclaiming her animus. Jung believed that creativity is one of the purest doorways to the self. It bypasses the ego and gives voice to the silent side of the soul. Another way is through dream analysis. If you've ever had a dream about a mysterious man or woman guiding you, challenging you, seducing or confronting you, pay attention. These often symbolize your inner anima or animus, trying to get your attention. They want to help you evolve, not hurt you. The more you understand these inner figures, the more insight you gain into your relationships, your decisions, your fears and your hidden power. Let's not forget, the self is not a goal, it's a process. It's a becoming. Every time you pause instead of reacting, listen instead of assuming, reflect instead of judging, you're stepping toward your higher self. This is the kind of transformation that doesn't make noise, but changes everything. Carl Jung didn't hand us a rulebook. He handed us a mirror and dared us to look. And that mirror doesn't lie. Once you've glimpsed the wholeness within you, you can never unsee it. But to truly understand how deep this unconscious wisdom goes, you'd have to hear the story of Jung's schizophrenic patient, the one who unknowingly described an ancient sun ritual no one else could have known. That moment cracked open the mystery of the collective unconscious, and what Jung found was astonishing. Carl Jung once shared a case that forever changed how we see the human mind. A young schizophrenic patient described, in vivid detail, a vision of the sun emitting a tube of wind, something spinning, radiating power. At first, it sounded like a psychotic delusion, but Jung's instinct said otherwise. Months later, he stumbled upon an ancient Mithraetic papyrus never before published describing that exact image. The patient had no way of accessing that knowledge, and yet, he knew this wasn't a coincidence. Jung recognized it for what it was, evidence of the collective unconscious, a vast reservoir of symbols, memories, and archetypes that every human inherits. It's where the anima, animus, and shadow dwell. It's where myth and madness blur. According to Carl Jung, our unconscious nature doesn't just reflect our personal past, it taps into something much older, deeper, and eerily universal. Think about that. A man deemed insane, channeling ancient wisdom lost to time. What if madness, in some cases, is the psyche's last resort when ignored for too long? Jung didn't see mental illness as mere pathology. He saw it as symbolic communication from the deeper layers of the soul. When the ego can't handle the weight of the unconscious, it fractures. But even in the chaos, there's a pattern, a message, a myth trying to surface. That vision of the sun and wind wasn't just poetic. It was a spiritual metaphor, a bridge between inner and outer worlds. Jung believed that schizophrenia might be the explosion of unconscious nature into consciousness, unfiltered and overwhelming. The patient didn't need to be silenced. He needed to be understood. And for Jung, that meant listening beyond the words, beyond logic, into the language of symbols. Many dismissed the case as luck, but Jung wasn't interested in skeptics, he was interested in what it meant. Why do myths from Greece, Egypt, and India echo the same symbols? Serpents, fire, rebirth, descent into darkness. Because these aren't just cultural artifacts, they're embedded in the collective unconscious, waiting to be rediscovered in dreams, visions, and yes, even breakdowns. It's important to understand, not every psychotic episode holds sacred meaning. Jung knew that, but he also believed that treating the unconscious like an enemy leads to more suffering. He urged therapists not to just medicate the chaos but to interpret it, to ask, what does this symbol want to say? What part of the self has been ignored? What truth is erupting through madness because it has no other outlet? There's a fine line between mystical insight and mental collapse, and that's where Jung did his most courageous work. Instead of pathologizing everything, he invited us to listen to the symbols, to see that sometimes the anima emerges as a goddess in a dream, not to confuse but to heal, that the animus might appear as a warrior, not to dominate but to strengthen. These are not delusions, they're expressions of a soul trying to find its balance. Even today, many psychologists struggle to embrace Jung's view. It's easier to categorize than to contemplate, but Jung's brilliance was his refusal to reduce the psyche to symptoms. He saw the mind as a sacred map, filled with archetypal tyrannage, neurosis, a clue, each vision a compass, and in that Mithraic symbol, he found proof that the ancient still lives within us, whispering through our unconscious nature. For those on a spiritual path, this opens a powerful door. It means your dreams, your anxieties, your symbols aren't random. They may be echoes of the collective. Maybe the wolf in your nightmares isn't fear, it's your shadow. Maybe the unknown man who appears again and again is your animus, asking to be seen. Maybe you're not lost, you're being led back to something sacred within. Jung didn't ask us to blindly believe, he asked us to observe. He gave us the tools to map our dreams, our complexes, our symbols, and told us to follow them inward. He believed that within the madness of the world and even within our personal suffering there is order, there is myth, there is meaning, and often that meaning is the key to healing what we thought was broken. But here's the twist. If even psychosis can carry the voice of the ancient psyche, then surely the shadow must hold more than just darkness. Carl Jung knew this better than anyone. And it's precisely in the heart of the shadow where something precious waits to be found, something creative, wild, and surprisingly real. We've been taught to fear the shadow, to see it as the dark, ugly part of us that must be suppressed. But Carl Jung had a different take. He believed the shadow doesn't just contain our flaws, it holds our forgotten power. Beneath the repressed anger, shame, or guilt, there's a core of instinct, passion, and authenticity. The unconscious nature isn't a pit of monsters, it's a vault of buried treasure, and most people don't even realize they're standing right on top of it. Think of the artist who was told as a child to get a real job. They abandoned their creativity, and it slipped into the shadow. Years later, they feel blocked, unfulfilled, disconnected. What's missing isn't outside of them, it's inside. Jung would say their anima is starving for expression. When they finally return to painting, or writing, or building, they don't just feel joy, they feel whole. That's the shadow, offering a gift, not a threat. Or take the quiet man who was taught to stay polite, never raise his voice, never challenge authority. That man may seem peaceful, but inside, his animus is caged and boiling. When he begins to integrate it not through violence, but through confident action, he becomes assertive, clear, even magnetic. Jung never said the shadow should run the show, but he warned that repressing it turns kings into servants. The shadow is also where realism lives. While the ego often lives in idealized stories, I'm fine, I'm successful, I've moved on, the shadow cuts through the fluff. It knows what you're actually feeling. It knows when you're pretending. This honesty may sting, but it's what brings depth. Carl Jung believed that facing your shadow could actually make you more compassionate, because once you see your own darkness, you stop judging everyone else's. Humor, too, is part of the shadow. The quick wit, the sarcastic comment, the ability to laugh in dark moments, these are all signs that your unconscious nature isn't entirely locked away. They show integration in action. Some of the wisest people are also the funniest. Why? Because they've been to the depths, made peace with it, and came back with perspective. That kind of humor isn't just entertaining, it's healing. And let's not forget instinct. Carl Jung saw the shadow as the container for our primal intelligence, not the intellect, but the gut, the part of you that knows when something's off, even if it sounds logical. When someone seems nice, but your body tenses, that's the shadow whispering truth. Integrating this instinct sharpens your intuition. It connects the anima and animus in real-time decision-making. You stop second-guessing yourself and start trusting your internal compass. We often envy others for qualities we've buried in our own shadow. You might admire someone's confidence, not realizing it's a mirror of your disowned boldness. Or you might judge someone's arrogance, when deep down, it's a trait you were punished for. Jung encouraged us to pay attention to our emotional reactions. Whatever sparks envy or contempt in you, that's your shadow pointing toward something undeveloped but needed. Some of the most successful people in history were those who befriended their shadow. They didn't become great by being nice all the time. They became great by owning their edges. Steve Jobs had intensity. Maya Angelou had rage that turned into poetry. Carl Jung himself admitted he had a dark side, and that's what made his light so powerful. Integration isn't about being good. It's about being real. There's a biological truth to all of this. Our nervous systems were designed to respond, adapt, and defend. Emotions like fear, anger, and grief are not mistakes. They're signals. When you suppress them, they don't disappear. They go underground, into the unconscious nature. The longer they stay there, the more distorted they become. But when you bring them into awareness, they become guides instead of enemies. If you've ever felt stuck, numb, or lost, it's likely your shadow has something to say. Maybe you abandoned your creativity, your assertiveness, your fire. Maybe it's time to invite those parts back, not to dominate your life, but to complete it. Jung believed that real freedom comes from wholeness, not perfection. That means embracing the entire cast of your inner world, not just the parts you think will get applause. And now that you see the shadow holds more than just pain, what if it's also the key to your evolution? What if, instead of running from it, you started working with it? That's exactly what Jung explored next. How to practically engage with the shadow day by day, with eyes open and soul awake. Working with the shadow isn't about fixing yourself, about becoming more conscious of what's already there. Carl Jung made it clear, the shadow isn't evil, it's unknown, and what we ignore gains power. So the first step isn't dramatic, it's honest. You have to want to know what's hiding in your unconscious nature, not because it's glamorous, but because the alternative is living half a life. And if you're already here, reading this, chances are you're ready. One of the simplest yet most effective tools Jung recommended is keeping an emotional journal. Not a gratitude list, not affirmations, a raw, unfiltered log of your real emotional responses. Felt like snapping at your boss today? Write it down. Felt resentful toward your partner? Don't sugarcoat it. The point isn't to judge or correct, it's to observe. That's how you begin to unmask the shadow, because once it's seen, it loses its grip. Dreams are another gateway. Jung considered dreams the direct voice of the unconscious nature. Keep a notebook by your bed. Record everything you remember, especially the strange, disturbing, or repetitive ones. Don't rush to interpret. Just sit with the images. Over time, patterns emerge. A man always running. Maybe your animus is being ignored. A recurring female figure offering help or chaos. Your anima might be trying to guide you back to balance. Shadow work also thrives in solitude, but not isolation, the kind of solitude that's intentional. Taking time to be alone without distractions, walking in nature, sitting in silence, turning off the constant noise of the persona. In these moments, your shadow will whisper, and it won't always be poetic. Sometimes it just wants to say, I'm angry, or I feel small. Listen, let it speak. That's how trust is, built between the conscious and the unconscious. You can also track your triggers. Make a note every time you feel irrationally angry, jealous, or deeply uncomfortable. What were you reacting to? Who triggered it? What part of you felt attacked? These reactions are gold mines. They expose the wounds, the unmet needs, the lies you've told yourself. Jung would say, the trigger is the teacher, and your job isn't to suppress the reaction, it's to decode the message beneath it. Art is one of the most powerful shadow tools, especially if you don't consider yourself creative. Draw the monster, write the angry letter, sculpt the ache. The point isn't beauty, it's release. Carl Jung often had his patients draw mandalas, symbols from the collective unconscious, to access deeper truths. These symbols bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the soul. Don't overthink it. Just let the shadow create something. Therapy, of course, is a powerful ally in this journey. But not just any therapy. Look for someone trained in Jungian or depth psychology, someone who knows the terrain of archetypes, anima, animus, and the shadow. A good guide doesn't fix you. They walk beside you while you face your own dragons. Jung believed that the therapist must have met their own shadow first, otherwise they're just guessing in the dark. Another method: practiced radical honesty in safe relationships. That doesn't mean dumping your darkness on people. It means gently letting trusted friends or partners see more of you. Instead of saying, "I'm fine," try, "I'm feeling overwhelmed today, but I'm working through it." It's not about drama, it's about authenticity. When the unconscious nature is allowed into conversation, it stops screaming for attention in unhealthy ways. Ritual can help too. You don't have to be religious. Light a candle, write what you're letting go of, burn the page, or create your own ritual that marks the intention to integrate. Jung respected symbolic acts deeply. He knew the psyche responds to metaphor more than logic. When you ritualize your commitment to shadow work, your subconscious listens, and something shifts. And remember, shadow work isn't a one-time project, it's a lifestyle, a way of walking through the world with your eyes open and your masks off. Carl Jung believed that wholeness wasn't about becoming perfect, it was about including everything, every voice, every fear, every forgotten strength. You're not fixing your shadow, you're learning to walk beside it with compassion and clarity, because the more we heal our individual shadows, the more capable we become of seeing the shadow out there in the collective. And that's a whole other level, because when groups deny their dark side, history tends to repeat itself. But more on that in a moment. If you think the shadow is dangerous on a personal level, wait until it goes collective. Carl Jung warned that when societies ignore their collective shadow, the consequences aren't just emotional, they're catastrophic. This isn't just philosophy, it's history. Wars, genocides, systemic oppression, they all begin with denied parts of the collective unconscious nature. When a culture refuses to acknowledge its dark impulses, those impulses don't vanish, they erupt. We see it all the time. Nations projecting evil onto the other, political parties scapegoating entire groups, religions demonizing opposing beliefs. It's easier to dehumanize than to reflect. Jung saw this as mass projection. Instead of owning our aggression, we paint the enemy with it. Instead of acknowledging our own contradictions, we moralize and divide. The result: chaos disguised as righteousness. The shadow is thrilled. Think of Nazi Germany, a nation that repressed its collective wounds, financial despair, and cultural humiliation. Instead of integrating those feelings, it projected them outward, minorities, onto scapegoats. Carl Jung watched this unfold with horror. He saw how quickly the unconscious nature could turn civilized people into mobs. The shadow, once ignored, doesn't ask permission. It takes over, with terrifying precision. And it doesn't just happen in dictatorships. Collective shadow lives in everyday institutions, education systems that crush individuality, corporations that exploit without guilt, media that profits from division. It's subtle, but powerful. We're taught to play rolesmen, suppressing their anima. Women denied their animus, children molded into obedient consumers. And when these repressed energies build up, they explode in crime, addiction, extremism, or despair. Social media has become a breeding ground for collective shadow. Outrage culture, cancel mobs, dehumanization, it's all there. Reshare content that reinforces our identity bubble, and anything that threatens it gets labeled as dangerous. But Carl Jung would ask, what are we really reacting to? Is it truth, or our shadows staring back at us through someone else's face? When enough people disown their pain, that pain becomes policy. When enough people repress fear, that fear becomes nationalism. That's how the unconscious nature of a society begins to rule the surface. Jung didn't just see the psyche as an individual journey, he saw it as a mirror for humanity. And when the mirror cracks, we either face what's been hidden or we let it devour us. Even well-meaning movements aren't immune. Activism driven solely by rage, without self-awareness, can replicate the very oppression it's trying to fight. Jung was clear: change that doesn't begin within will eventually collapse. That's why shadow work isn't just personal, it's political, it's spiritual, it's systemic. If we want a better world, we have to deal with the darker forces underneath the slogans. Healing the collective shadow starts with personal responsibility. When we do our own integration, we stop feeding projection machines. A man who's connected to his anima won't need to dominate others to prove he's strong. A woman who's embraced her animus won't settle for silence when she knows her truth. That inner balance spreads. It affects families, communities, even nations quietly, but powerfully. Education must evolve, not just facts and figures, but emotional intelligence. Children should be taught about archetypes, symbols, shadow, and self. Imagine a generation that understands their unconscious nature before it controls them. That's how we stop history from repeating itself, not through censorship, but through consciousness. Jung believed this wasn't just possible, it was essential. Art, storytelling, ritual, and honest conversation all have roles to play. They offer ways for collective shadow to surface without destroying everything in its path. As Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The same applies to cultures. Until we name the shadow, we are its puppets. But once we do, we begin to reclaim our humanity. And that's what leads us to the next step, not just seeing the problem, but stepping into the responsibility. Jung knew healing couldn't happen through gestures alone. The collective shadow doesn't dissolve through apologies, it demands truth, accountability, and a real willingness to change. Carl Jung believed that healing the collective shadow wasn't just a moral obligation, it was a psychological necessity. The past doesn't vanish. It lingers in the unconscious nature of a culture, shaping beliefs, emotions, and behaviors. When atrocities are denied or glossed over, they don't disappear, they mutate. That's why apologies aren't enough. True healing requires something deeper: honest reckoning, active remembrance, and courageous responsibility. Think of countries built on slavery, genocide, or colonialism. Saying we've moved on doesn't erase the wound, it infects it. Jung argued that if a society represses its guilt, that guilt festers in the collective unconscious, often passed down through generations. The result? A loop of denial, defensiveness, and projection. Healing starts when a nation stops defending itself and starts listening, not to be right, but to understand. This doesn't mean indulging in shame. Carl Jung wasn't a fan of guilt as a lifestyle. He saw guilt as a signal, not a sentence. Once acknowledged, it becomes fuel for integration. If shame freezes us, awareness moves us. That's the point. Not to stay stuck in remorse, but to use it as a catalyst for transformation. To look the shadow in the eye and say, "You're part of us now, let's evolve." Collective healing also means honoring every voice, especially the ones that have been silenced. A culture can't heal when only the victors write history. Jung would say, the anima, the feminine, receptive principle must be restored in the social psyche. That means listening, receiving, feeling, not dominating with narratives, but opening to complexity, contradiction, and raw human truth. This is why dialogue matters. Not performative conversations, but real, uncomfortable, heart-centered dialogue, the kind where people cry, confess, get messy, and stay. Jung believed that the integration of opposites like anima and animus is where new life begins. Applied to society, this means inviting opposing perspectives to coexist, not in competition, but in creative tension that births renewal. Some cultures use ritual to process collective pain. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Rwanda's community tribunals, these weren't perfect, but they acknowledged the shadow publicly. That matters. Carl Jung saw ritual as a bridge between the unconscious nature and conscious life. Without ritual, trauma stays stuck. With it, the wound has a place to speak and begin to heal. Art is another powerful healer, not just for beauty, but for truth. Music, film, poetry, murals, these carry the stories that textbooks won't. They give voice to the silenced and form to the formless. Jung often pointed to myth and symbol as ways the collective psyche expresses itself. When art becomes a mirror for the shadow, we stop pretending and start processing. Healing the collective shadow doesn't mean we'll never make mistakes again, but it means we'll stop repeating the same ones blindly. It means leaders who've done their own shadow work can govern with clarity instead of ego. It means citizens who don't need to blame outsiders for their inner emptiness. It means less fear and more wholeness. Not utopia, but something real, grounded and possible. And it starts with us, with individuals choosing to face their own past so they can show up more consciously in the present. Carl Jung didn't believe in waiting for governments to heal us. He believed in inner revolution, that if enough people become whole, the world shifts, quietly, radically, from the inside out. So what do we do now? We listen more than we talk. We read what challenges us. We sit with what makes us uncomfortable. We explore our unconscious nature and stop pretending we're separate from the systems we criticize. Because we're not. We're part of the collective, which means we're also part of the solution. And when we begin to walk this path not perfectly, but honestly, we come face to face with the greatest invitation of all, to evolve. And in that evolution, Carl Jung believed we find not only healing but wholeness, which brings us to the final step in this journey, embracing the shadow and moving forward with purpose. This entire journey through shadow, persona, anima, animus, the unconscious nature, and the collective leads us to one place, the truth of who we are. Carl Jung never promised comfort, he promised depth, and depth demands courage. Courage to see ourselves fully, not just the light, but the ache, not just the goals, but the ghosts, because only when we see it all can we begin to live free. You've followed this far, you already know, the shadow isn't your enemy, it's your unfinished conversation with yourself. And when you finally sit down and listen, truly listen, it speaks. It tells you where you've been holding back, what you've been running from, and what you're truly capable of becoming. That's not weakness, that's real power. That's what Carl Jung called individuation, the path to wholeness. We live in a world obsessed with appearance, with curated identities, polished smiles, filtered lives. But beneath all that is the real you, complex, raw, beautiful. And the shadow, it doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to make you honest. It wants to reintroduce you to the parts you've abandoned so you can live with full aliveness. Integration isn't about being fearless. It's about being real. In the face of fear. And yes, it's hard. You'll resist. You'll want to quit. You'll feel lost. But that's part of the path. Carl Jung said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. But he also believed that the pain is not the end, it's the initiation. Once you pass through it, you start to access the deeper well, the instincts, the creativity, the intuition, the insight. You become the person you were meant to be, before the world told you who to become. You don't need to do it all at once. Start small. One emotion you won't repress. One truth you're finally willing to speak. One dream you'll take seriously instead of brushing it off. That's shadow work. That's soul work. That's your unconscious nature saying, thank you for finally listening. And once you begin, life starts feeling less like more like a homecoming. You're not doing this alone. Everyone around you is walking around with their own shadow in totem, dragging it, others dancing with it. But when you face yours, you become a lighthouse. People sense it. They trust you more. You respond differently. Relationships shift. Reality feels deeper. Carl Jung didn't want disciples. He wanted individuals, awake, responsible, alive. So, if you're still here, that means something clicked. Maybe it wasn't loud. Maybe it was a whisper in your chest. But pay attention to that. That whisper is the beginning of your healing, the start of your personal revolution. Don't let it fade. Feed it. Explore it. Let it lead you where your anima or animus wants you to grow. Because the most important work you'll ever do is the work within. Before you go, ask yourself, what part of me have I ignored? What fear have I been feeding? What truth have I been afraid to say out loud? And what would change if I finally welcomed all of me? The answers aren't easy, but they're yours, and in them lies your liberation. If this journey made you feel seen, if it sparked something real, then I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to this channel. Activate notifications, because we're not done exploring the mind. There are deeper layers, richer insights, and more tools ahead. Carl Jung opened a door. We're going to keep walking through it together. This isn't just a video, it's a movement of awareness, courage, and conscious living. And your presence here makes it stronger. Thank you for listening. Thank you for showing up. Now go meet your shadow and bring it into the light. I'll see you on the next step. Now that you've looked the shadow in the eye, the real question is, what are you going to do with what you saw? Will you keep hiding from yourself, or are you finally ready to listen? What part of you have you been silencing just to fit in? What emotion have you labeled wrong that might actually hold your power? What if everything you've been running from, your fears, your rage, your vulnerability, is exactly what you need to become whole? Carl Jung didn't give us a map to avoid the darkness, he gave us a lantern to walk through it. So tell me, which part of this journey hit you the hardest? Drop it in the comments. I want to know which insight cracked something open inside you. Let's build this space together, for real conversations and real growth. And if this video gave you even one insight that made you pause, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because we're just getting started. There's so much more about the unconscious nature, the anima, the animus, and the deeper truths within you that no one ever taught you to face.